So, welcome to the 9th Asian Pacific Translation and Intercultural Studies Forum. My name is Olgierda Furmanek, and I am the director of the Interpreting and Translation Studies program here at Wake Forest University. We are co-chairing and co-hosting this forum together with Hawaii University and Chihuahua University. So welcome to the forum. We are really thrilled and happy that you were able to join us. We are very excited and looking forward to hearing your presentations. And we will proceed accordingly as we have announced. So we will have 3 presentations, and after each presentation, we will have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. The audience will be taken from the chat, or we can also have people join us by unmuting themselves and showing starting on the video for more interaction. So it is a little bit more dynamic and more impersonal. So it is my pleasure to start this session on the otherness, because the otherness, your presentations, all of them, they are a little bit challenging the concept of translation or looking at new dimensions and new perspectives and thinking how we can expand the concept of translation. That's what we just heard in our keynote speech number 2 with Dr. Du-Chao Lee. He was talking about challenging equivalence a little bit, thinking about expanding the concept of translation beyond just the meaning transfer. So we hope that this session will actually be a beautiful extension of that definition of translation, of what translation is and what translation is not, as we will hear in a moment. So it is my pleasure to start this session with the introduction of Dr. Marek Kuźniak. Dr. Marek Kuźniak is actually coming from my hometown, from Wrocław. He is a professor of linguistics at Wrocław University in Poland. Wrocław is in the west south part of Poland, and it's very fitting that we have a presenter from that town because it is considered by many scholars and by many historians as the most intercultural city in Europe. We have had Norman Davies talking about that, so let me just give a little insert here that the Wrocław has been actually part first of all of the Polish kingdom, and then was part of the Czech Empire, Hungarian Empire, Prussian, German, and finally it's Polish again. So my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marek Kuźniak, who is the head of the Institute of English Studies at the University of Wrocław. He is also a member of the State Examination Commission to conduct examinations for certified translators, as well as a certified translator of English himself. Probably translates a lot, so not just a scholar, but also an educator and a translator. So Dr. Kuźniak is the author of books and articles focusing on cognitive linguistics, so crossroads between translation and cognitive linguistics, pragmatics and philosophy of language. And congratulations on the most recent book. I see that it is has just come out with Paul Graf Macmillan, Geometry of Choice, Language, Culture and Education. And Dr. Kuźniak, yeah, congratulations. Yeah, I will be looking forward to reading it. I just discovered that it has been published. So Dr. Kuźniak is a member also of numerous Polish and international academic associations and have published articles in various journals. It is my pleasure to introduce his talk that will deal with what translation is not, a very intriguing topic. So my great pleasure and welcome, Dr. Kuźniak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Furmanek, for having me at this conference. I would like to invite you into, yes, some sort of discussion over the story of delimitation, let's say, of translation studies. I mean, I'm not going to be probably very innovative in what I'm going to say. My goals are rather modest in that I would try to order some discussion which we have in translation studies or around translation studies when it comes to the place, the subject matter, and probably the status, institutional status of translation studies. Some of the elements of that talk also have an impact on the ethics. I mean, the way we conduct arguments in translation studies, and we will see how delimiting yourself, how constraining yourself, how trying to find some limits to what we are doing may turn out to be, let's say, I don't want to say healthy, but you know, maybe for us hygienic, or let's put it that way. So those three aspects, institutional research and ethics, there will be sort of kind of pivotal elements of that talk of about why translation is worth talking in a sort of negative, apophatic way, as the term is used in theology. Apophatic, that means by using negative elements. Okay, I am a cognitive linguist, so I will try to look at that issue of why things do not count as translation from that point of view. And I will look at the role of container image schematic thinking as central to my understanding of the problem of translation. Why one reservation? When I use the term translation, I mean also translation of oral text. I will try to show the difference between translation and interpretation, as this distinction is of course valid and binding in Western translation studies. In Poland, we don't have such a distinction. We say just translation. We say oral written translation. But just for the sake of this particular talk, whenever I mention the term translation, I also mean interpreting, okay? What may be a necessary step in that process of talking about the limitation of the scope of translation studies is coming back to the so-called form-based translation. That is the linguistics-based translation studies. Why? Because you will see that the form-based translation studies is deeply rooted in that container imagic schematic thinking, which is the most fundamental level, metaphoric level at which we conceptualize translation as such. And then I will propose the continuum kind of two poles, ego and eco, as hopefully operational, functional at the level of distinguishing various strands of translation research. And I will conclude at the end, hopefully. In 2013, Theo Hermans, in his paper, What is Not Translation, sort of tried to raise that issue of not in translation studies. But his argument actually finally has gone towards the recognition of translation as a cluster, rhizome-like concept, while at the same time marginalizing the aspect which strictly fall out of the TS research area. So his paper wasn't so much to seek limitations, but rather to conclude that contemporary translation is like rhizome. It just spreads in different directions, and many avenues, and yeah, not necessarily all the avenues need to be compatible one with the other. So this rhizome-like concept is some sort of a fact in the discussion on translation. I will come back to that. I should also mention the famous debate initiated in the paper by Chesterman and Arojo, Shared Ground, from 2000. The debate over what we have in common, yeah, as translators, interpreters, living in different parts of the world, employing different paradigms of research and translation studies. So the debate continues, and my talk is like, I believe, just a minor contribution to that discussion. I suggest that it's much more productive from the cognitive linguistic standpoint to look at translation as a bounded rather than unbounded phenomenon. When you look at the container schema, which I consider fundamental to our discussion, you have, from the cognitive linguistic point of view, the container schema has got the fuzzy edges. It has its in-out poles. And I believe that the contemporary dispute over the place and status of translation may be sort of encapsulated, so to speak, within the poetics of the container schema. How, I will show you in a second. In discussing container, we need to also mention transfer foundations of translation, which is characteristic of the language-based translation research. You have this famous Michael Reddy's conduit metaphor from 1979 that describes translation, well, communication in general, because that metaphor was about communication, but later on it was extrapolated onto translation. As you have communication as transfer, yeah, from one place to another. And this discussion in cognitive linguistics, I mean, there was a lot of criticism around that transfer metaphor. But Professor Krzeszowski from the University of Warsaw in Poland actually defended as a cognitive linguistic, defended that conduit metaphor, saying that if we discuss this metaphor at the very schematic level, yeah, then the metaphor doesn't seem to be working much in reality, because, you know, we never get the information across so perfectly as we intend. There's always some sort of distortion on the way. Yeah. But when you contextualize that metaphor, when you look at when you take account of the arrow of time, which is characteristic of the second law of thermodynamics, which says that all forms of organizations decrease in time when left to their own devices. So then this conduit metaphor starts to work. Yeah, and I would like to maintain that position that was put forward by Krzeszowski in 1997's book on Angels and Devils in Hell. That was the provocative title of his monograph, in which he discusses the problem of the conduit metaphor. So I would like to keep to that Krzeszowski stand, and because it allows me to understand the place of a human being as a translator, but also to understand better the translation itself. According to that container kind of, or in line with that container image schematic thinking about the world as such, space in which we live is a container. Yeah? Human body that is in space. Yeah, we are living in that space. We are also containers. So we are containers in containers. Via metaphorical projection mapping, language is defined as container as well. Yeah, that's this conduit metaphor that works in our communication, and consistently verbal signs are containers as well. So there's a lot of container thinking, yes, about our communication. Fillmore, 1982, calls that envisionment, a particular envisionment of the world. I mean, that the fact that certain domains of our life sort of shape in a specific way our thinking about that world. And one of such image schemas that regulates that way we behave, we think about, we live by is container. Plus time, this linearity of time, which is guaranteed by the second law of thermodynamics. We know that time may be conceptualized in different ways in different parts of the world, but time from the physical point of view and is a linear kind of conceptualization, because things change in time, things decrease in time, unless we put some effort to stop it, but we know we can't stop the time. So it's with us, all the time, and it passes by. So the linearity of time is a part of that conduit metaphor, and it ensures the dynamics of the overall conceptualization. So all this discussion about container, image schematic thinking has led me to think about translation, whether understood as product, process, or research in general, as ego or eco-oriented. As ego is correlated with the in pole of container schema, whereas eco is correlated with the out pole of the container schema. So those two kinds of ways of handling the business of translation may be characterized by the following. The ego is conventional, verbal, sign-based, exclusive, whereas eco is contextual, multimodal, and inclusive. And how to reconcile all these two camps? Well, it seems to be hard to reconcile. If you suggest some sort of continuum line within translation studies research, ego-eco continuum, then you see that convention, context, monomodality, multimodality, translation, interpretation, they may be said to be elements that are inherent of that container in-out poles, unless you on the proviso that you add to that otherwise stable structure of container some sort of elasticity, which in cognitive linguistics is one of the principles that, containers are never stable. They are fuzzy categories, so arranged around or according to the principle of prototypical effects. So with all these in mind, it seems that you can have this sort of continuum line, ego-eco, within translation studies. Again, what helps me to think about this problem this way is that I try to delimit myself to thinking about translation as container, as something which is which has its stable in and stable out. I'm not searching beyond that. And I believe that within that delimitation, the circumscription of translation studies, within that container conceptualization, I mean, all those tensions may be somewhat resolved. So ego-focused approaches to translation are characterized by symbolicity of signs, cause effect, consequentiality, and localness, so micro-studies. Whereas eco-focused approaches to translation, they are characterized by creativity, they stress creativity, rhizome-like effects, and they often stress globalism. As discussed by one of the researchers, I'm just going to move to that. But prior to moving to some sort of exemplification of ego-focused approach to translation, let me start with the ego-focused approach to translation as past manifest in Jakobson's paper on linguistic aspect of translation. Note the inter, intra, in elements as crucial in his distinction of the types of translation. Interlingual translation being the translation proper, as we know. The eco-focused approaches, which are, I repeat again, they are correlated with this out element of the container, are manifested in, but may be manifested in this sort of quote from Petrilli. Excuse me. So Petrilli says that what is translated is always retranslatable. That translation is like interpretation, two faces of the same process, inseparable like the two faces of the same sheet of paper, has no limit. Yeah? And this is because translation and interpretive processes are constitutive of semiosis, and semiosis is infinite. That's, I believe, the manifesto of eco-focused approach to translation. How ego, now let's have some sort of intellectual experiment, how ego-focused approach to translation may deal with this sort of manifesto without distorting much of the meaning of the original. So, of course, this is my sort of paraphrase. What is translated may always be translated in many different ways. Yeah? But translation, like interpretation, and here there's agreement, yeah, there's two faces of the same process, but they are constrained by space-time and knowledge limitations. And this is because translation and interpretive processes relate to conceptual system of SL and TL, which are largely composed of conventional meaning-bearing elements. Yet these systems are by nature open-ended. So
excuse me, you have 3 more minutes. 3 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. 3 more minutes. Very much. Thank you.
So, so there is one more institutional aspect to our discussion. The Polish classification of sciences, my home ground, where translation studies does not exist as a discipline due to the problems that it's heterogeneous, that it's run by different. This is conducted in different universities. So there is the problem of ontology, its subject matter, let me maybe move on to the ethical issues, because this is this third element I also forgot to mention. The problem, yes, between the ego and eco camp is that the criticism around the language-based translation has become absoluticized in the sense that language-based translation research has largely become undermined for its dogmatism and simply dismissed as passé. Yeah? So it seems that language-based ego and eco, this is a false alternative. They can be squeezed within the same kind of way of thinking, the container image schematic thinking. Unless we move from the category of sameness to the category of similarity in our thinking about translation. We stop thinking about totalness or totality of equivalence, but we use the approximative narrative in our discussion, which is in line with the conceptual and fuzziness and contextual effects at the offstage and onstage level, respectively, in cognitive linguistics. So let me show you that. Susan Bassnett's critique of what I call ego translation. Total equivalence and sameness of meaning, the two areas which she criticizes. If now you have other examples of, let's say, egoists, yeah, Titler, complete, same, all the ease, the very known principles of translation. If you modify these the way I show in the right-hand column, probably the tension could be much more extenuated. Look at NIDA. Yeah? Requirements conveying the spirit, having a natural and easy form. The requirements of translation. If you change the narrative, you make it a little bit more tentative, more approximative, you just maybe you won't be subject. It won't be subject to such criticism. The same with Catford. Full translation change into maximally viewed translation. Partial translation change into restricted viewed translation, and so on and so forth. So my topic should be, self-corrected. What translation is not shall be corrected into what translation is not, but in inverted commas, just to show that it's just a metaphor, not stating the hard fact. Okay. So concluding, translator as a liberal ironist. I don't think I will have time to develop or elaborate on that. But what comes out of that discussion is that we try to find the balance. We try to avoid the radical, the dogmatic. Yeah. When we do this, I believe we may save a lot of time criticizing each other's camp. The container schema I already discussed. So the consequence of the adoption of container in-out is the fact that ego-focused translatology is primary. It's a neutral state. It's not judgmental. It's neutral statement. Whereas eco-focused translatology is secondary, derivative of ego-focused translatology. Hatim and Monday, I'm finishing. Hatim and Monday proposed the ambit of translation, which I agree with. Still, however, I highlight the elements that may still be subject to discussion. There is this social cultural context. There are terms which are broad and they may allow for some addition in that catalog, which is the weakness of that translation. However, the three elements I believe are quite adequate, and because they integrate those ego-eco poles I mentioned. So the essence of translation seems lost where the language-based roots of translation activity are lost from sight. The constraining spatial temporal effects of human activity are ignored, and the long-term memory aspects behind translation activity are ignored. That is, conventional aspects of conceptual structure that underlie intellectual activity of the translator. So final thing, back to the roots, translation is not to be seen as, I just want to avoid the dogmatic is not. You see, I try to become consistent with what I'm trying to get across. It's not to be seen as exclusive of ego. That is this original form meaning pairing, the in element of the container, but it shouldn't be also seen as exclusive of eco, the contextual elements, which are correlated with the out pole of container. Essentially with the fuzzy boundaries, and it is not to be seen as all-inclusive. Otherwise, we can go astray. I believe and we can talk about the same thing using different notions, or talking about different things using the same notion. So that's problem. That's a problem. Okay, and here are the references. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for extending my time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for this interesting and all-inclusive presentation. I think, we are all moving away from those very strict definitions of equivalences and trying to see, what's beyond. It's interesting, your metaphor of a container, because in the keynote speaker, Professor Lee from Hong Kong Polytechnic University, so I think you might find it interesting, he just said that in his research, he came across in Tagalog language, translation is expressed by a term that signifies pouring a liquid from one container to another. So Tagalog uses for translation interpreting actually the fluidity of, so the translator, is the one who is pouring from one to another. So this whole concept of fluidity and liquid kind of, with the container, that takes very, very, very interesting. So yeah, thank you very much. So we will take questions right now. Let's see if there's any questions in the audience. Anybody has a question in the audience? And you just look in the chat. Yes, yes, we have Dr. Burgos, the Associate Director of the Translation Interpreting Program here at Wake Forest. Please, Dr. Burgos.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I just wanted to highlight that some of our speakers, including our keynote speakers, have, converged to the point that equivalence should be probably debated. And I would like, however, to hear what a good definition of equivalence is, because someone might see it in relative terms, but that probably is a different talk. So my question is basically referring to a slide that you showed where you locate translation at the ego age, at the ego side of the continuum, and then interpretation at the other, which suggested to me that translation was only ego. But then in this last slide, I see that translation is not to be seen as exclusive of ego or exclusive of eco. So could you please explain briefly, if you can, why you have translation in one side of the continuum and interpretation in the other side in that slide?
I would, yeah, they are on the. Thank you very much for this question. The translation and interpretation are sort of suggested as residing in the opposite poles. But they are still within the same container. I mean, the translation here, the translation of text as more rigorous kind of business is correlated with the in element, with this conventional, symbolic kind of with the principles of conventionality, symbolicity, and full meaning pairings. Of this, the traditional philological enterprise, whereas interpretation, I still see as part of the container, but out. The container, it cannot be. It doesn't mean that it's excluded from translation. Yeah, it's like that inalienable part of it. It's like another side of that sort of the same sheet of paper that we have, but it's here. Moved to the outside, just to suggest that in interpretation we usually allow for more freedom. Yes, when it comes to I don't know, assessing the quality, the adequacy. I know it from my own perspective as an examiner when I have to assess someone's written production as opposed to oral production. Oral production always. I have to be more understanding when it comes to interpretation. Interpretation is a broader phenomenon. It takes account of contextual effects. You have the elements of fatigue, you have the elements of stress, and so on and so forth. All these are contextual, situational. That's why I put them towards the out pole. I'm not trying to say that these are out, like they are towards. This is continuum line. Yeah, but this whole continuum is a part of one image schematic conceptualization, that is container, which has its in and out. The container cannot exist without these two poles. It's constitutive of these two elements. So when I'm saying that things are moved towards the out, I'm not trying to argue that these are dismissed as less important or just excluded from translation. They are part of it, but yeah, they have it. They are more contextually, situationally oriented than in areas of business. That is the translation proper. When you have to, like, a biblical translation would be the prototypical, let's say, the in-oriented element, where you have to care about forms, meanings, conventions, and so on and so forth. That's how I see it, at least. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We have to move to the next presenter right now, but if there are any other questions, please email Dr. Kuźniak. So if you could put in chat your email, then so people can just email you later on. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate more contribution from cognitive linguists. There's a lot to collaborate as far as and to explore together as far as interpreting, especially. So cognitive linguistics and the conceptualization of interpreting as well. Thank you very much. And right now, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. The next speaker is going to talk about, interestingly, a contextual influence, right, on the translation. So contextualization and its setting. And it's my pleasure to introduce Chi Li, and she's a PhD candidate in transcultural studies and at the University of Calgary, right? Very cold out there, still some snow.
Yeah.
A little bit of snow outside.
Snowed yesterday. Yeah.
Well, okay, but so welcome to North Carolina with a little bit of sunshine and warmth. Chi Li, as I said, is a PhD candidate in transcultural studies, and her research interest includes post-colonial translation theory, cultural translation, a very interesting concept, literature translation, anthropology, cross interaction with translation, Chinese linguistics. So again, we have cognitive linguistics, cultural linguistics, and translation pedagogy. So in her research, she's currently looking to understand how history, and especially heritage museums, influence identity shaping the context and limitations of translation. So we welcome Chi Li, and please start your presentation right now. Welcome.
Okay. Let me share the screen. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction, Professor Furmanek, and hi, everyone. Thank you for your interest in my research. It gives me great honor to present among the established scholars with on the same panel. And my paper is to investigate how the history presented in a Chinese-English bilingual heritage museum has been written, translated, and interpreted by translators, and how those visible translators, as opposed to invisible translators, rendered the history within the frame or within the constraints of the translation policy of the museum in question, as well as the culture policy of the People's Republic of China. In a word, my focus is on the translation strategy applied by the target museum and authoritative expectations for the translators, or to put it in other words, whether or not the translation in the museum coincide with the culture diplomacy policy of PR China. And I'm arguing that, contrasted to the assimilative translation strategy, the targeted museum has adopted a sinocentric translation strategy, inviting audiences to make positive efforts to encounter the exotic and at the same time expressive otherness presented by the museum, where the museum creates an ingress into the target language, which is English, as well as an ingress into the target culture in a form of elucidative strangeness. And such sinocentric translation aims to serve the goal of the national image establishment and re-establishment, as well as publicity. And such goal is to be achieved by conceiving translation and interpretation activities in museum context as manifestations of ourselves, Chinese as ourselves. As for sinocentric translation, it is to translate selfhood instead of rendering the other, which invites its audience to get to know something that is normally considered as the exotic other to them. Ooh. So I would like to begin by defining the translation in question. First, the translation studied in the paper is the translation as the rendering and representation of culture and history. On the one hand, museums depend on translation between languages or between semiotics and languages to convey factual information about the exhibits and exhibitions. And on the other hand, and more importantly, museums rely on the interpretational perspective of languages, of both English and Chinese in my case, to make meanings in line with their own interest and to shape a reality through certain exhibition with certain translation activities. And these translation activities are compatible with the anthropological understanding of translation, where from an anthropological point of view, translation can include a variety of process for message exchange between cultures, facilitating mutual understanding with verbal and nonverbal signs. Therefore, translation activities in museum context can be found in introductory texts, labels, on displays, audio guides, or audiovisual media, and interpretive programs, including tour guide services, etc. And along with the parameters of translation, the translators in question not only include persons who express the meaning of speech from Chinese into English, in my case, but also the producers of the introductory materials, transferring the information from objects to languages, including Chinese and English-speaking tour guides communicating museum's interpretation to English-speaking visitors. Now I would like to clarify the projected role played by the Heritage Museum in question in my research. First, in the paper, museums are not seen as the temple for the absolute truth. And along with the existence of museums and museum discourses, there lies power relations. That is to say, the truth is only true in a certain context. According to Foucault, each society has its own regime of truth. They include, for example, the types of discourse, such as society, harbors and causes to function as true, the mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true from false statements, etc. And hence, truth is a system of ordered procedures for the production, regulation, distribution, circulation, and functioning of statements. And my goal is to study how the museum discourse is represented to the audience in English within its own regime of truth. And I believe Carol Duncan, a scholar in museum studies, would echo the description of the power relations in museum context, because in her analysis of the political power of museums, she elaborates on the ritualistic character of art museums, where participation in museum rituals affect civilization and nationality. In her research in the ritualistic character of museum art demonstrated, for example, during the course of visiting a museum, one is expected to behave with a certain decorum. And she described how the organization of the museums serve as a script designed for visitors to enact, and argues that museums offer well-developed ritual scenarios, most often in the form of art historical narratives that unfold through a sequence of spaces. As such, museums educate and also discipline citizens. Therefore, according to Dr. Robert Neither, museums can interest translation study scholars in two ways. First, museums can be treated as cultural translation. And second, translation are inevitable in most of the museums. And my paper aims to investigate museums as cultural translations through primarily looking at the translation activities in the museum. And based on the definitions, the paper is trying to find out the overarching translation policy in the target museum. And my question includes, what is the overarching translation policy? Are the translators working for the target museum visible or invisible? By visible and invisible, I mean, are their translation activities heavily enforced by the market and the readership? And are the translators enforced to translate in accordance with the prevailing notion of fluency, or are they guided to try their best not to adapt, unless by absolute necessity, not to adapt the culture text so as to make it a smooth communication with the English-speaking visitors? And therefore, with such queries and questions in mind, my burning research question is how the history presented in the Bilingual Heritage Museum has been written, translated, and interpreted by the translators. And a supplementary question following the umbrella question would be how much the translation strategy coincides with the culture policy of the country. And by asking the third question, I would like to know the context where the translators and their translations are positioned. And in the paper, my research object is the Chinese English Bilingual Heritage Museum, located in mainland China, and it is built on a mausoleum site of a Western Han emperor. And the target museum has its own publicity sector. The sector is responsible for implementing cultural policies of the nation, and one of their duties is to provide suggestions and guidance for translation activities. In addition, the majority amount of English translation work is done in such a sector as well. And to answer my research question, I used three approaches. I have done semi-structured interviews with the relevant personnel in the publicity sector of the museum, including the translation policymakers and the major translator-in-chief. And my questions for them were mainly focused on the museum's perspective on the function of English translation, the museum's requirements and expectations for translators, etc. In the interviews, I also learned that the publicity sector of the museum developed a textbook to train English-speaking tour guides. And the latter are required to learn, to memorize, and to retell what is wrote on the textbook in their communication with visitors. And through the second method of text analysis, I aim to find out the way that the history is explained, focusing on whether the translator are bringing the text to the audience or inviting the audience to come close and learn about the exotic Chinese history. And through the method of document analysis of the nationwide culture diplomacy policy, I tried to locate the culture policy that could support the translation policy in my target museum. Now I will briefly present on my finding with examples. So in my semi-structured interviews with the translator-in-chief, who is also the translation policymaker in the museum, my guiding question as well as the follow-up questions are designed to understand what crucial quality in the museum in the English translation in the museum that my interviewee valued most. And I got a definitive answer from the interviewee that the accuracy of the information is placed at the top of the pyramid of requirements for translators and their translation work, even surpassing the smooth transmission of cultural information as well as the smooth reception of those information among the audience. In order to further understand my interviewee's expectations for translators, I asked, what do you think of the museum's name in English that is currently in use? And one piece of important side note is that the English translation I am referring to is a transliteration of the museum's name in Chinese, plus a capitalized English word museum after the transliteration. I was also curious about why my interviewee didn't choose to include more, for example, introduction words about the function of the museum in a name such as Emperor blah, 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 Mausoleum Site Museum. Then I was informed that it is my interviewee who translated the name, and one of the reasons for the transliteration is for the purpose of being concise. Also, my interviewee believes the direct translation of the Chinese museum name makes the English-speaking visitors to understand beforehand that they are going to visit a place which is strange to them, and the things they're going to see are very likely not affinitive to their own cultural background, even though similar cultural phenomenon is shared among them. And when it comes to the comparison between the transliteration and the translation I proposed, as you can see on the slide, my interviewee considered that the longer translation, even though include more information regarding what the museum is about, still lose crucial information, for example, about location of the museum, which is indicated in the name of the museum in Chinese. So this piece of conversation clearly demonstrates that the Chinese to English translator is actively building a gap between different languages and cultures so as to make a stance of being the other, which is reluctant to be adapted easily and inviting or even waiting for the audience to come close to the exotic culture and historical content rather than rendering the exotic content to meet the learning habit of the audience. And the translation strategy finds a continuation, I think, and even an elevation in example 2. So that example comes from the sample cases in the textbook used to train tour guides developed by the museum. So in the book, the sample case section lists all kinds of possible intractable situations that tour guides might encounter in communication with visitors. And the book provides the trainees with the best practices. So the case is about the situation where foreign visitors coming from outside of China commented on the entire political system of China as cruel and barbaric after knowing that the emperor ordered war prisoners to build his tomb, and his order caused injuries and even death among those prisoners. The best practice in reaction to such comments suggested by the book is, and I quote and start translate, of course, the visitors and tour guides are encouraged to freely discuss and express opinions on historical questions. But the key is that the discussions should be based on a relative comprehensive understanding about Chinese history. So if the tour guides notice that the visitors' biased opinion is due to lack of knowledge about the Chinese history, then it is their responsibility to help visitors have a broader and general picture about the historical backgrounds so as to protect the national image, end quote, and end translation. So the textbook suggests the tour guides should respond to the negative comments and queries with detailed explanations of the political system at the time of Han Dynasty, saying that the emperor governed the country based on Taoist philosophy, and Taoism taught the rulers not to intervene too much of the lives of the civilians. However, the reason for the emperor to spend efforts to build his tomb was because of a specific belief. And in the feudal China, emperors believed the construction of a mausoleum site, of a grand mausoleum site, would tranquilize the state. And it also has an influence on the continuity of the reign of the emperor. Therefore, the grand mausoleum site like this, like the Han Emperor's tomb, became inevitably necessary in the minds of the feudal emperors, and it should be considered as a production, as a typical production of the feudal time along Chinese history. So from such case, we can notice that the tour guides are instructed to actively and positively respond to queries from visitors coming from different cultural backgrounds. Specifically, when negative queries arise from visitors, tour guides are instructed to not to try to avoid collisions of different opinions so as to pursue a harmonious atmosphere of communication. But there's advice to provide more information to facilitate the visitor's understanding of the information that might be exotic and difficult to process due to unfamiliarity and other factors such as ideological difference. So based on the analysis of culture policy, such translation coincides well with the national policy, the national culture policy. For example, earlier in 2013, the notion of spreading the Chinese voice was first proposed in a nationwide conference. And in the year 2020 and 2021, such notion has been improved by detail enhancement. And the second quotation on the slide mentioned one of the criteria for good Chinese historical story, as it says, the story should accurately demonstrate the culture signature of China. Therefore, we can see that from the policymaking level, China is trying to move away from the image shaped by the others to the image reshaped by Chinese themselves or ourselves. Then how do the Chinese see the place of the reshaped image on the world platform? I think the idiom 和而不同 with the ancient Chinese philosophical thinking of harmony without uniformity has appeared in many speeches and policies to show the stance. So inspired by Schleiermacher, by Venuti, and by Steiner, the translation strategy guiding the translation practice can be, and in my opinion, further analyzed by dividing it into 3 phases. So the first phase would be tension creating based on difference by making the SD, the source text, aggressive to the audience, meaning the audience are required to make active efforts absorbing the culture and historical information. An obvious example could be visitors need to find a way to bear with the strangeness created by the transliteration of the name of the museum, right? And the second phase could be creating an ingress into the otherness by making the strange other more expressive, meaning the translators further work on culture and historical information that is already perceived as exotic and strange to the audience to some extent, so the audience can find a bit of ease after strong culture collision happened in phase 1. An example could be visitors find having war prisoners to build the emperor's tomb is cruel and barbaric, judging from the perspective of the contemporary social norm and ethics. But after learning about the historical background, they might not call the emperor a tyrant anymore, at least when they walk out of the museum. And as for the last phase, after the incorporation of the alienated information, the museum and the visitors will reach a phase of elucidative strangeness, meaning that the visitors clearly understand what they visited in the museum, show a different culture and civilization that is supposed to be strange to them. As for how this Sinocentric way of belief of translation can contribute to restaging the universality, well, it is too big a topic to be conveyed today, and I don't have the time, but there are 2 points that worth mentioning. First, by restaging the universality, it doesn't mean to create a tit-for-tat confrontation between cultures with a fixed boundary. It is about, secondly, and on the contrary, providing resources for the knowing subjects, according to Hegel and Butler, to encounter the world so as to expand their knowledge reservoir on which they rely on to know the world. So it is an invitation for the subjects to set aside the feelings of strangeness and exoticism for a while so they can focus on the undoing and redoing of both themselves and especially for their world views so as to get closer to the concrete universality. And,
excuse me, 3 more minutes. 3 more minutes.
Okay, I'm going to finish in 1 minute. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great.
Okay. So at the very least, I would like to include the further directions I have in mind to proceed with the topic. So besides looking for more theoretical support from seminal works in philosophy, I have been working to further describe the sinocentric way of translation by, for example, studying the reception and readership of the translation with elucidative strangeness. But unfortunately, due to COVID-19, I'm quite limited to do the field research, so that plan got postponed. Also, I'm trying to include more case studies so as to find out whether there are diverse forms to achieve the elucidative strangeness. And that would be the end of my presentation. I would really appreciate it if you could share your suggestions, comments, and questions to help me improve the paper. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and all the ideological issues, right, that we have to deal with, not just cultural, not just linguistic, but also ideological and societal, that also create the context in which we work. So thank you for daring and taking the courage to share it with us at this stage, because I can see that it's still shaping and going into a very interesting direction. So I admire your courage, and we appreciate that you are able to share such an interesting, very impressive corpus of research with us. So I'm opening the floor for questions. If there are any questions, we have time for questions for Chi. Any questions, suggestions for Chi Lee? Let's see, I'm looking at the chat. Yes. Yes, we have Dr. Burgos, please.
Yeah, I can ask you a brief question. I know we're running out of time, but yes, I know that, you know, the context of museums is multimodal. We have pictures, we have texts, and then that seems to me a little bit, you know, like an analogy to audiovisual translation. When you're translating, like in painting description, that's like when translating subtitles. Half of the information is in the visual representation of meaning. Was that a problem for you in your research?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Professor. So audiovisual translation and multimodality is like another 2 perspectives in my PhD thesis, and this and including this my PhD thesis also include this topic. So yeah, they're like parallel topics and sections in my entire research project, and I would definitely include these 2 perspectives.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. We have another question from Dr. Fasola. So please, Dr. Fasola, you would like to ask your question? Carlos, can you unmute yourself? Or do we need to unmute you? Carlos, you are muted, Diego.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Perfect. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just had a question about the relationship between your proposals and maybe a dynamic equivalence theory or Scopus theory, because one of the problems that I always had with these theories is that they're not truth preserving. So I'm thinking of a sentence like, this mausoleum was built by prisoners of war. Now, in an original context to the target audience, that may be perfectly normal. The Chinese audience at the time, I think, of course, that's what they're for. Who else would do it? But in the target audience of the present time of foreigners who are visiting this mausoleum, this would not provoke the same reaction. So a Scopus theory, which was looking to preserve the same reaction among the audience might say something like, this mausoleum was built by contractors, right? Because that's normal, that's expected, that would be the same reaction, but it wouldn't be true. But your theory, I think, is interesting because it's not seeking just to preserve the truth. I think it is, but you also want to sort of ameliorate the target audience reaction to make it less negative. Maybe by explaining more context, explain the Taoist philosophy. Just how do you see your proposal in relation to these other theories of scopus or dynamic equivalence?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I would see at this stage, I would see this translation strategies or the norms adopted by my target museums, they are kind of against what the perspective that you described about the scopus theory and the dynamic equivalence. Because from my field research data, I kind of noticed the translators, they're not trying to, I'm sorry to say that, but not trying to make the audience comfortable. They're trying to make the audience to understand what is the truth, what is the fact. I cannot say the truth, but what is the fact in there, and to help them understand what's the logic at that time in that specific historical context, what the logic is there, and so as to achieve a kind of understanding, like on the same platform. It's not a kind of a Western gaze or an Oriental gaze on this historical, on those historical facts or the histories presented in those museums. So yeah, I think it's a very good idea to kind of discuss the dynamic equivalence and scopus theories in my thesis. Yeah, I'm going to write it down, but I don't see a quite fit of those two theories in my in the thesis to support the evidence I found in the field.
Yeah, I agree. It's not the same thing. I thought maybe there's just a move or sort of a concession to those theories that we want to sort of mitigate the initial negative reaction from the target audience. How can we avoid that? That's what I sort of picked up on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, so please communicate through email or through chat. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our third speaker. Our third presenter is Dr. Lily Han. Can we see Lily coming in?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Great, perfect. So great pleasure to have you with us here, representing another cultural dimension, so very much tricultural and trilingual and trisocietal. Dr. Han is the director and the dean and associate professor of the School of Languages and Translation of Macau Polytechnic Institute in Macau. And over the last decade, yeah, welcome from that part of the world, right? with the Portuguese history behind. Beautiful. Yeah. So over the last decade, Dr. Han has lectured and conducted research in interpreting studies, mostly acting as trainer for the conference interpreting for an interesting combination, Chinese, Portuguese, and English for the European Union, correct? Yeah, very interesting. So probably very needed right now and might be needed most of the time in the future, right? With more interaction. So yeah, Dr. Han, research interest include interpreting studies, training of interpreters, intercultural studies, language and translation policies, interpreting testing and assessment, which is an important topic because we need to know what kind of students we can allow into our programs and how to improve further training and further education of our interpreters, and especially a new rising topic, computer-aided interpreting, all from translanguaging perspective. So translanguages, Chinese, English, Portuguese, this is going to be also the focus of her topic because she will be talking about translanguaging analysis of the film Love After Love. So again, multimedia, multimodality, multi-language, all different dimensions. Looking forward to your presentation. Let's welcome Dr. Han. Please start your presentation. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Furmanek, for introduction. So my topic is meaning making in the untranslatability, a translanguaging analysis of the film Love After Love. Okay. So film have been held for a long time tradition as a meaning making in visual and audio play, in the hybridization of language, image, and sound, as well as in interactive synchronization with the audience viewers. So through the emerging theoretical stance of translanguaging, this article analyzes the translingual practices, performance instances in a Chinese film entitled Love After Love, adapted from Eileen Zhang's short story and directed by the Hong Kong director Annie Hui, in which a Portuguese sonnet lyric poem, Hymns, is delicately crafted in the film. Through this analysis, we aim to examine how translanguaging aesthetics transcend language boundaries, transforming from the seeming untranslatability to communicative meaning-making practice. The film presents a situated and embodied poem recital scene that encompasses untranslatable moments of imagination, thus transcending the Mandarin, English, Portuguese divide. The encounter and the intertwining of heterogeneous languages and registers create a transformative space replete with tensions between reality and imagination, between lucidity and ambiguity, between resistance and compliance, interrogating the underlying discourses beyond the languages and rendering the untranslatability meaningful. This translanguaging informed film review thus offers an insightful autopsy of the literary aesthetics of the novel by Eileen Zhang. So what is translanguaging? The concept was originated from the Welsh revitalization program. It is inspired by established concepts of languaging and multi-competence. Translanguaging has now emerged as a practical and powerful theory of human recognition, cognition, and communication by Professor Li Wei that transcends disciplinary boundaries and linguistic boundaries. Over the last 2 decades, this concept, these movements have made inroads into multiple domains in arts, humanities, social science, and beyond, including bilingualism, multilingualism, translation, and interpreting. These are some of the books about translanguaging and also about translating. The act, according to Professor Li Wei, the act of translanguaging creates a social space for the multilingual users by bringing together different dimensions of their personal history, experience, and environment, their attitude, belief, and ideology, their cognitive and physical capacity into one coordinated and meaningful performance. Trans in translanguaging means beyond the boundaries, transcends disciplinary boundaries and linguistic boundaries, transcends the boundaries between human cognition and communication. While ING in translanguaging, it means a dynamic process whereby multilingual language users mediate complex social and cognitive activities through strategic employment of multiple semiotic resources to act, to know, and to be. Translanguaging also emphasizes the multisensory, multimodal, multisemiotic, and multilingual nature of the meaning-making process. In this process, a principle of abundance is in operation. That is, as many different cues should be produced simultaneously as possible in order to facilitate communication. The structure of this PPT includes 3 aspects. I will talk about translanguaging and meaning-making in the film, then sound, image, and language versus untranslatability, and also translanguaging instances in Love After Love. For the first aspect, the meaning-making practice takes place as a dynamic process of negotiation between the filmmakers and the audience, viewers, during which the filmmakers create images, sounds, and languages, while the viewers make sense of the images and stories on the screen. In the go-betweenness and beyond of the audiovisually constructed multi-semiotic and multimodal systems, structures, practices, translanguage-informed space is created, where viewers as embodied agents embrace the ongoing interactive moments of tensions and negotiations in relation to language, image, and sound of audiovisual texts. It can be argued that translanguaging is the methodological apparatus through which the audience or viewers employ to understand the meaning of the film, in which it empowers the communicative ability by resorting to multiliteracy in comprehension and analysis of the audiovisual means of the film. As to the second aspect, as most films have multilingual APFTIS by adding subtitling or dubbing to facilitate multilingual communication, one linguistic issue in relation to translatability and untranslatability constitutes an inevitable topic in audiovisual meaning making. In the present study, instead of discussing the unconciliated binary dilemma of translatability and untranslatability, our focus goes to examine the dichotomy from an opposite point of view. Untranslatability can be viewed as not a curse, but a blessing. It reminds us that translation is always hard, and it lends translation a tragic nobility. It leads translation not to throw up their hands in despair. Instead, it energizes and spurs them on to ever more resourceful creative responses. In this positive binary relationship, untranslatability is not seen as a translingual thing, but as bliss that embraces more resourceful and creative responses, which enables the audience viewers to break the conceptual boundaries of translation, resorting to their multimodal and multisemiotic repertoire at their disposal to get a situated, embedded, embodied, and enacted translingual experience. Now let's see the concrete example, the film Love After Love. The film and its translingual practices are analyzed as a case study for illustrating the audiovisual meaning making and untranslatability phenomenon. By adopting translanguaging as an analytical perspective, we explore how the audiovisual control of the film, sound, image, and language extends the semiotic and spatial repertoires to enable the audience viewers to create a translanguaging space for translingual meaning making in the seeming untranslatability. Multimodal analysis with screen snapshots will be used to analyze the audiovisual data, augmented with the textual analysis of the original work. It is argued that translanguaging aesthetics transcend the language boundaries, fully exploiting the semiotic audiovisual resources for creating an ongoing interactive space in the film, thus transforming the seemingly untranslatability into a communicative meaning-making practice. Such a translanguaging space, in turn, allows the audience viewers to reconstruct a more engaging environment for film appreciation. Let's see this example. On the left is the original text, and the right part is our translation. Wei Long picked up a bench and sat down. Qiao Qi also followed to sit down. After a while, Wei Long chuckled. We sit silently for 3 minutes, as if we are in mourning. Qiao Qi responded, when two persons sit together, do we have to talk? As he was saying, he stretched his arms over the chair where Wei Long was seated. Wei Long continued hurriedly, it would be nicer if we did talk. Qiao Qi replied, if you insist, I will speak to you in Portuguese. Then he began to speak in low voice. Wei Long tilted her head, hugged knees, listened for a while, then smiled, saying, I don't understand. Maybe you are cursing me. Qiao Qi replied in a gentle voice. Did that sound like cursing? Suddenly blushed. Wei Long lowered her head. Qiaoqi continued, I translated it into English for you, but I'm not brave enough. Wei Long, in her turn, covered her ears, saying, who wants to listen? Then stood up and walked towards the crowd. In the film, this poem was illustrated. In fact, it was a Portuguese poem by Luís Camões. In his famous poem, it's called Lusíadas, and it followed the Italian sonnet ABBA, CDC, DCB, like something like that. Amor é fogo que arde sem se ver, é ferida que dói, não se sente. Okay. Since the film has only the subtitling, so in fact, this kind of message is not totally translated. The tensions among the sound, image, and language in meaning negotiating shape and more dimensional and reinforced in the film by Anna Hui. In Love After Love, the Portuguese sonnet recital is added as a sound design to reinforce the aesthetic effects. Its musicality and underlying message of love in untranslatability leave space for imagination, ambiguity, and compliance, in contrast to the Chinese English subtitled contents, which point to the reality, lucid immediacy, and resistance. The sound, image, and language in this Portuguese sonnet recital episode exert transformative power in meaning-making. The following are the multimodal episodes of the Portuguese sonnet recital. In a total of 15 seconds, we divided into 8 instances. For the image dimension, the focus is put on the camera position, the body movement, gesture, and facial expressions of the protagonists. For the sound dimension, emphasis is put on the background music and the spoken language. As to the language dimension, both spoken language, the sonic aspect, and the written language, the visual aspect, are presented. So we can see these snapshots or multimodal instances of these audiovisual texts. On the left is the snapshots of the film, and on the right part, we can see the translation. The protagonist said, I'll speak to you in Portuguese. And then some recital of the poem. Then the conversation. The protagonist proposed that he will translate it into English for Wei Long, and Wei Long responded, who wants to hear it? So Wei Long's refusal confirms once again the untranslatability of the poem. Once it is translated, all the ambiguous aesthetics dilutes. The translation is not necessary here, since the love message has been transmitted undeniably via all available audiovisual signs. Translanguaging makes meaning-making a possibility by transcending sound, image, and language, adding beauty, fascination, and pleasant ambiguity to communication. The lens of translanguaging allows us to mobilize all available sensory repertoires of the audience, viewers, in meaning negotiation, thus transcending linguistic boundaries and transforming from the seeming untranslatability to meaning-making communication, instead of being lost in translation. So the insidious love messages in the Portuguese sonnet poem are naturally deciphered and unfolded in the interwoven audiovisual signs, whereas the poem's content lost their weight in literary aesthetics. Above all, we believe this translanguaging informed film review thus offers us an insightful autopsy of the literary aesthetics of the novel by Eileen Zhang and its adapted film. So that's the content of this PPT. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. Truly translanguaging, new concept and interesting. Yeah, I can see a lot of people clapping. So I can open the floor for questions. We have exactly 5 minutes. So thank you for, and I see a lot of applauding again in the chat. So for Lily Hen, also from Billy, we are getting some acknowledgement from Billy. As you can see, they're having 6 to 7 people watching on Billy, our presentation. So it's really a large number. So very interesting. And so I'm concluding this session. We don't have time to take more questions for the other presenters because we are starting parallel sessions in 15 minutes. So we need that break of 15 minutes. It was great to see everybody from all over Europe, Canada, the Poland, Canada, and Macau. Truly interlingual, truly intercultural session. Appreciate getting to know you and wishing you all the best in your professional endeavors. Yes, I see some clapping to Poland in the chat, some clapping to Canada, yeah, and also to Macau. So always bringing in the Portuguese language as well. So thank you very much. And this concludes the session. And I thank you for being part of this Asian Forum. We are hoping to revive it. Professor Luo said that this is the new beginning for this very important and prestigious forum. Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you at the conferences or somewhere else. Thank you very much. We are concluding the session. Bye-bye. Bye.